In the Middle Ages, while most people were busy dodging plagues, trying not to burn themselves with reheated barley soup, or simply surviving another winter without freezing their fingers off, medieval knights were engaged in something that, at first glance, sounds far more thrilling: training to become the human war machines that dominated battlefields. But don't be fooled by Hollywood's depictions of gleaming knights leaping from castle walls with epic music in the background or personal trainers yelling, "One more rep!" The reality was far less glamorous, much sweatier, and frankly, sometimes smelled like a mix of old leather, horse, and desperation. A knight's training was a long, exhausting, and occasionally ridiculously uncomfortable process designed to transform a young noble into someone capable of wielding a sword, riding a horse, and surviving a battle without ending up like a shish kebab. Let's dive into how these guys actually trained, without polished armor or cinematic filters, to understand what made them the feared, and sometimes clumsy warriors of their time. First, let's clarify what a knight was. He wasn't just a guy in shiny armor riding around the countryside looking for dragons to impress the ladies. Being a knight was a profession, a social class, and, above all, an enormous responsibility. In medieval Europe, knights were the military elite, the equivalent of modern tanks, but with less fuel, more maintenance, and an odor that didn't improve with time. They were tasked with protecting their lord's lands, leading armies, and generally preventing chaos from taking over. But getting to that point wasn't easy. Nobody woke up one day and said, "I'm going to be a knight, pass me the sword." The journey began in childhood and could last over a decade, filled with sweat, bruises, and lessons that today we consider a mix of military boot camp and a medieval reality show. The process started early, usually when a noble boy was between 7 and 10 years old. At this stage, future knights were sent away from home to serve as pages in a feudal lord's castle. Imagine being an 8-year-old, saying goodbye to your crying mother at the door, and heading off to a cold, damp castle full of grumpy adults who probably smelled of stale beer and rusty metal. Being a page was hardly a fairy tale. Your daily tasks included thrilling duties like polishing armor, sweeping stables, running messages across the castle, and serving dinner to nobles without spilling wine on someone important's lap. A mistake like that could earn you a withering glare or, worse, a long-winded lecture on the importance of etiquette. Spilling wine on a noble wasn't just a faux pas. It could mean a week cleaning stables as punishment, which wasn't exactly the most fun way to pass the time. But it wasn't all scrubbing floors and dodging disapproving looks. Pages also began training in skills that would be crucial for their future as knights. One of the first things they learned was how to ride a horse. This sounds more fun than it actually was. Medieval war horses, especially those bred for battle, weren't the cute ponies you'd find at a kid's fair. They were massive beasts, trained to charge into battle, kick enemies, and generally have little patience for a clumsy kid who didn't know how to hold the reins. Pages practiced riding every day, learning to control the animal, stay in the saddle, and, hopefully, avoid ending up face-first in the mud in front of the entire castle. Falling off a horse wasn't just painful, it was humiliating, because you could bet the other pages and a few knights would be laughing their heads off while you picked your dignity up off the ground. And it wasn't just about pride. A fall could mean a sprained arm or a bruise that reminded you of your mistake for days. Besides riding, pages started getting familiar with weapons, though not the real ones. They used wooden swords, which were less dangerous but still capable of leaving a lump if you weren't paying attention. These training sessions weren't exactly epic battles. They were more like a bunch of kids clumsily whacking each other while an older knight shouted things like, "Lift the sword, don't drag it like it's a broom." The goal was to teach them the basics of combat: how to hold a weapon, how to move without tripping over their own feet, and most importantly, how to keep going after taking a hit to the ribs. These practices also helped develop coordination and strength, because even a wooden sword was heavy enough to make you sweat after a few minutes. Pages also learned to handle a shield, which wasn't just a piece of wood for blocking blows but also a tool for pushing, unbalancing an opponent, or, in a pinch, doubling as an improvised tray for carrying more wine to the banquet, though that wasn't exactly part of the official training. Being a page wasn't just about riding and fighting with sticks. They also had to learn etiquette and manners, because a knight didn't just need to be good with a sword but also know how to behave at court. Pages studied how to speak respectfully, how to bow without face-planting, and, yes, even how to dance. Because nothing says, "feared warrior," like a good twirl on the dance floor during a banquet. These lessons might have seemed boring to a kid more interested in swinging a sword than learning the steps to a pavane, but they were essential. A knight who didn't know how to behave could embarrass his lord, which was far worse than losing a joust. Imagine the disaster of showing up at a banquet and not knowing how to greet a duke without offending him. It was the medieval equivalent of sending the wrong emoji in a group chat. Around age 14, a page who had survived years of menial tasks and basic training would advance to squire. This was a big step, like going from errand boy to a knight's personal assistant. But don't be fooled. Being a squire wasn't a ticket to fame. It was hard work, full of responsibilities ranging from polishing your knight's armor to following him into battle with a spare shield. Squires accompanied their knight everywhere, which meant tending to his horse, keeping his weapons in good condition, and generally ensuring the knight was ready to shine, or at least not make a fool of himself at any moment. If the knight needed his sword, the squire handed it to him. If the horse got skittish, the squire calmed it. And if the knight decided to get drunk at a banquet, the squire probably had to drag him to bed, which wasn't easy considering a drunk knight in armor weighed about as much as a small ox. A squire's physical training was far more intense than a page's. At this age, the goal was to turn a lanky teenager into someone capable of bearing the weight of full armor, wielding a sword for hours, and, hopefully, not passing out in the process. One of the most common practices was combat with wooden weapons. Squires faced off in simulated duels, whacking each other with swords, maces, or even wooden lances that, while not sharp, could leave a bruise the size of an apple. These sessions weren't just about improving technique, they also toughened the body and mind. Because, let's be real, if you couldn't handle a hit to the ribs during training, you probably weren't ready to face a Viking axe in a real battle. Bruises were like training medals, though you probably didn't show them off proudly at the next banquet. Physical strength was another priority. Medieval armor wasn't exactly light. A full suit could weigh between 20 and 30 kilos, and that's not counting the shield, sword, helmet, or anything else the knight decided to carry. To prepare, squires did exercises that today would seem like a mix of CrossFit and medieval punishment. Running with weights, climbing ropes, lifting logs, or practicing with sand-filled sacks were common activities. They also trained to mount and dismount a horse quickly while carrying all that weight, which was much harder than it sounds. Try climbing onto a horse with 25 kilos of metal on your back and let me know how it goes. Most squires probably had moments where they ended up trapped under their own armor, wondering why they didn't stay home and become monks. These exercises not only built strength but also taught endurance, because in a battle, it wasn't enough to be strong. You had to stay strong for hours. Weapons training was the heart of a knight's preparation. While squires started with wooden weapons, they eventually moved on to practicing with real ones, though blunted to avoid accidents, or at least try to. They learned to use the sword, lance, axe, mace, and, in some cases, the bow. Each weapon had its own technique, and mastering them all took years of practice. The long sword, for example, wasn't swung like you were chopping wood. It required precision, balance, and a good dose of patience to avoid exhausting yourself after 3 swings. Medieval fencing manuals, like those of Fiore de Liberi or Hans Talhofer, show complex moves combining attacks, defenses, and disarming techniques. These manuals were like the self-help books of the time, but instead of teaching you to find yourself, they taught you how to avoid ending up with a sword in your stomach. Studying these manuals wasn't just about technique. It required memory and focus, because forgetting a move at the wrong moment could cost you dearly. The lance was another key weapon, especially for cavalry. Knights practiced jousting, which wasn't just a spectacle to entertain nobles but a way to train for war. Imagine galloping full speed toward another armed guy with a wooden lance, trying to hit him without falling off your horse or breaking a bone. Jousts were dangerous, even in training, and more than one knight ended up with a ringing head after a bad hit. But these practices were essential for learning balance, aim, and, above all, not panicking when a guy in 30 kilos of armor came charging straight at you. Jousts also built confidence, because if you could face an opponent in a tournament without trembling, you could probably handle the chaos of a real battle. Plus, jousts were a chance to show off a bit, because even in the Middle Ages, nobody could resist the temptation to strut in front of a crowd. Training on horseback was just as crucial. Knights didn't just need to know how to ride, they had to master fighting from the saddle. This included wielding a sword or lance while the horse galloped, which is much harder than it sounds. War horses, known as destriers, were trained to be aggressive and respond to commands even in the chaos of battle. Squires practiced maneuvers like quick turns, charging at a target, or even trampling a fallen enemy. Yes, horses were weapons too. This required an almost supernatural connection between knight and mount, something achieved only through years of practice and, probably, a few humiliating falls. A good knight could control his horse with his knees while using both hands to wield a weapon, which sounds impressive until you realize one wrong move could leave you sprawled on the ground with a very confused horse staring at you like, "Really, buddy?" Squires also learned to care for their horses, from feeding them to checking their hooves, because a poorly maintained horse was as useless as a broken sword. But a knight's training wasn't just physical. They also needed to train their minds. Military strategy was a critical part of their education. Squires learned to read the battlefield, coordinate with other knights, and understand tactics like cavalry charges or wedge formations. They also studied the strengths and weaknesses of different enemies, from English longbowmen to Scottish spearmen. Some knights even learned to read and write, which wasn't common in the Middle Ages, to study military treatises or communicate with their lords. This knowledge was essential, because a knight who didn't understand strategy was about as useful in battle as a chicken in a chess game. Trainers often organized simulated exercises where squires had to plan an attack or defend an imaginary position, teaching them to think quickly and make decisions under pressure. Mental endurance was also tested. A knight's life was full of pressure, defending their lord's honor, protecting their land, not embarrassing themselves in a tournament. Training included scenarios designed to mimic battle stress. For example, squires might be put in simulated fights against multiple opponents or made to practice for hours under the sun in armor that turned their body into a portable oven. The idea was simple. If you could stay calm while someone hit you with a wooden mace and your armor cooked you alive, you could probably handle a real battle. These exercises also built courage, because, believe it or not, even the bravest knights must have felt a knot in their stomach the first time they saw an enemy army approaching with bad intentions. Trainers often shared stories of past battles, not just to inspire squires but to teach them that fear was normal, but giving up wasn't an option. At around age 21, if all went well, a squire could be knighted. This was the big moment, the medieval equivalent of graduating college, but with fewer diplomas and more armor. The knighting ceremony varied by region and era, but often included a solemn ritual where the new knight received his sword, spurs, and, in some cases, a ceremonial blow to the shoulder or face, depending on how enthusiastic the lord was. This blow, known as the Cali in France, wasn't just a formality. It was a reminder that the knight had to be ready to endure pain and adversity. But being knighted didn't mean training ended. On the contrary, it was just the start of a lifetime of constant practice. Knights continued training regularly, participating in tournaments, jousts, and mock battles to stay in shape. Because, while being a knight sounded prestigious, it also meant you were one bad fight away from becoming a footnote in history. Tournaments were a key part of ongoing training. Though we see them today as spectacle-filled events with flags and applause, in the Middle Ages, they were a mix of sport, training, and a chance to show off. Knights competed in jousts, foot combat, and even melees, which were basically group brawls where everyone swung at each other like they were in a tavern after too much beer. These events not only kept knights in shape but also let them test new tactics, improve their aim, and incidentally, earn some prestige, or at least a few coins if they bet on themselves. But it wasn't all fun and glory. Tournaments could be dangerous, and more than one knight ended up with a broken arm or a concussion after a bad day on the field. Melees, in particular, were controlled chaos, with dozens of knights fighting in a confined area, requiring not just skill but a good dose of luck to avoid being crushed under a pile of armor. Training also varied by region and era. For example, in 13th century France, knights focused heavily on chivalry and jousting, while in 14th century England, the longbow was changing the game, and knights had to adapt to a more defensive style of warfare. In the Holy Roman Empire, fencing manuals like Talhoffers were practically sacred, with knights spending hours studying techniques to disarm opponents or fight in full armor. In the Iberian Peninsula, where the Reconquista was in full swing, knights trained to face faster, lighter enemies like Muslim cavalry, requiring a more agile combat style. In each region, knights tailored their training to the needs of their time, meaning a 12th century French knight would have a very different skill set than a 15th century Spanish one. Another often overlooked aspect is team training. Knights didn't fight alone. They were part of an army, which meant learning to work with others. Cavalry charges, for example, required impeccable coordination. Imagine a group of knights galloping together, trying not to crash into each other while aiming their lances at an enemy who wasn't exactly waiting with open arms. Group training included formations like the wedge, where knights arranged themselves in an arrowhead to break enemy lines, or the line charge, which was basically a stampede of horses and metal. These exercises not only improved cohesion but also taught knights to trust their comrades, because in battle, your life could depend on the guy next to you not screwing up. Trainers often organized large-scale mock battles where knights practiced maneuvers like flanking the enemy or retreating in order, which was much harder than it sounds when everyone's covered in metal and shouting at the top of their lungs. Diet also played a role in training, though it wasn't exactly what we'd call sports nutrition today. Knights ate what was available, often a mix of bread, meat, cheese, and beer or wine. Nobles had access to better food than peasants, but don't expect protein shakes or quinoa salads. A knight's diet was designed to keep them strong, not to win an abs contest. Protein came from meat, which could be anything from pork to venison, depending on hunting luck. Carbs came from bread or porridge, which weren't exactly gourmet but filled the stomach. And, of course, hydration was key, which meant drinking plenty of beer or wine, because water was often unsafe. Knights weren't exactly drunks, but let's just say a mug of beer was more reliable than a questionable well. In some cases, knights also ate fruits and vegetables, especially in wealthier castles, but these weren't the backbone of their diet. The idea was simple: eat enough to keep training, but not so much that your armor stops fitting. Rest was also important, though not always easy to come by. Knights in training lived in castles that weren't exactly five-star hotels. Beds were hard, rooms were cold, and the snoring of other squires probably sounded like a bear chorus. But sleep was crucial, because an exhausted knight was a dead knight. Trainers, usually older knights or weapons masters, knew the body needed recovery, so intense training days were often alternated with lighter tasks, like tending to equipment or studying tactics. Still, even on light days, a squire might find themselves running around the castle delivering messages or helping with banquet preparations, so real rest was a rare luxury. Speaking of equipment, maintaining armor and weapons was part of the training. Poorly maintained armor could rust, jam, or, worse, fail at the worst possible moment. Squires learned to inspect every piece, from the breastplate to the greaves joints, ensuring everything was in order. They also learned to repair weapons, sharpen swords, and, in some cases, even forge basic gear. This wasn't just practical. It taught them to value their equipment, because a broken sword in the middle of a battle wasn't exactly a fashion statement. Squires also learned to adjust armor to fit perfectly, which was critical, because ill-fitting armor could restrict movement or, worse, make you trip at the worst moment. This hands-on work also had a psychological side. Caring for your gear made you feel more connected to it, like your sword or armor was an extension of yourself. Training also included a healthy dose of humility. Knights, despite their status, weren't immune to mistakes, and trainers made sure to remind them of that. If a squire got too cocky, they might end up with extra chores, like cleaning the stables or carrying the group's gear. These lessons were important, because an arrogant knight didn't just risk their own life but also those of their comrades. Humility, along with courage and loyalty, was part of the chivalric code, which, though often romanticized, was a practical guide to keeping knights in line. Trainers often used stories of knights who failed due to arrogance as warnings, because nothing teaches better than a good cautionary tale, and a couple of days shoveling manure to drive the point home. As knights matured, their training became more specialized. Some focused on foot combat, learning advanced fencing or hand-to-hand techniques. Others specialized in cavalry, perfecting their ability to charge in formation or maneuver in rough terrain. And some, the most ambitious, tried to master everything, which was as exhausting as it sounds. But regardless of their specialty, all knights had to be ready to adapt. Medieval wars weren't predictable, and a knight might find himself fighting in an open field one day and defending a castle the next. This versatility was one reason knights were so valuable. They weren't just soldiers, but soldiers capable of handling almost any situation, from a one-on-one duel to a pitched battle with thousands of men. Training also had a spiritual component. Religion was central to medieval life, and knights were no exception. Many attended Mass regularly, prayed before battles, and, in some cases, vowed to protect the church. This doesn't mean all knights were saints. Some were more like the medieval equivalent of bad boys in armor. But faith gave them purpose and, in many cases, the courage to face death. Trainers often incorporated religious elements into practices, like oaths of loyalty or meditations before mock combat, to reinforce the idea that a knight fought not just for his lord but for something greater. In some cases, knights participated in rituals like the Vigil of Arms, where they spent the night praying before their knighting, helping them focus and prepare mentally for their new life. Over the centuries, knightly training evolved. In the early Middle Ages, the focus was on brute force and heavy cavalry, with knights charging like armored rhinos. But by the late Middle Ages, with the rise of longbows, crossbows, and later firearms, knights had to adapt. They learned to fight on foot more often, use lighter armor, and coordinate with infantry and archers. Tournaments also became more sophisticated, with stricter rules and gear designed to prevent injuries, though it didn't always work. Still, the fundamentals of training, strength, technique, strategy, and endurance, remained the same. A 15th century knight might have had more advanced armor than one from the 11th century, but both needed the same dedication to stay at the top of their game. One aspect we can't ignore is the role of weapons masters. These were experienced knights or specialized instructors who trained pages and squires. Some were true sword geniuses, able to teach techniques that made combat look like a deadly dance. Others, well, let's say they were more enthusiastic than talented, but even they could teach something useful. Weapons masters didn't just teach techniques. They also instilled values like discipline, respect, and the importance of not underestimating an opponent. Because, as any knight could tell you, the guy who looked harmless could be the one giving you a black eye at the next tournament. Masters also acted as mentors, guiding squires through the ups and downs of training and helping them build the confidence needed to face the challenges of knighthood. Training also involved a fair amount of improvisation. Not every castle had a perfectly equipped training ground, and not every lord could afford the best weapons masters. In some cases, squires learned from older knights who could no longer fight but could still shout instructions from a chair. In others, training was improvised with whatever was at hand. A tree as a lance target, a sack of grain as a practice opponent, or even a particularly nimble pig as a mock enemy, though that probably wasn't common. Creativity was key, because in the Middle Ages, there were no 24/7 gyms or apps to track your progress. This ability to improvise was also useful in war, where knights often had to adapt to unexpected situations, like muddy terrain, a wounded horse, or an enemy who didn't follow the rules of chivalry. A knight's training also depended on his wealth and status. Sons of wealthy nobles could afford better weapons, stronger horses, and more experienced trainers. Knights from humbler families often had to make do with second-hand gear and learn from whoever was available. But even the poorest knights strove to keep up, because in war, it didn't matter if your armor was new or inherited from your uncle. What mattered was knowing how to use it. This disparity also meant wealthier knights often had an edge in tournaments, where high-quality gear could make a difference. But on the battlefield, skill and experience were what really counted. As a knight gained experience, his training became more personal. Some developed unique fighting styles based on their strengths and weaknesses. A tall, strong knight might specialize in the mace, crushing armor like soda cans. A more agile one might prefer the sword and shield, moving like a cat on the battlefield. And the most clever learned to combine tactics, using terrain, weather, or even psychology to outwit opponents. Because, while strength was important, a smart knight could outmaneuver a stronger one by being more cunning. Some knights even experimented with new weapons or techniques, adapting them from enemies or other cultures, like the mounted archers of the Mongols or the tactics of Muslim cavalry in the Iberian Peninsula. Training also had a darker side. Injuries were common, and there wasn't exactly medieval health insurance to cover them. A bad hit in training could leave you limping for weeks, and a fall from a horse could be much worse. Knights and squires learned to treat basic wounds, like cuts or bruises, but fractures or serious injuries could end a career. And while training tried to be safe, accidents happened. More than one squire probably had a story about how I broke my nose in practice to tell at dinners. These injuries also taught an important lesson: the value of preparation and caution, because even a training session could be as dangerous as a battle if you weren't paying attention. A knight's training was also shaped by the culture of the time. In 12th and 13th century France, chivalry was steeped in romantic ideals, with knights swearing to protect the weak and uphold honor. This meant training focused not just on physical strength but on instilling a sense of duty. In other regions, like Germany or England, the approach was more pragmatic, emphasizing combat effectiveness over flourishes. But in all cases, training reflected society: hierarchical, demanding, and sometimes brutally competitive. Knights didn't just compete against enemies but also among themselves, in tournaments, training, and daily life, where prestige and honor were as important as sword skill. Over the years, knights also learned from their battlefield experiences. Every battle was a lesson, whether about dodging an arrow, maintaining formation under pressure, or handling panic when things went south. Knights who survived multiple campaigns became masters of their craft, and many returned to their castles to train the next generation. This cycle of learning and teaching ensured that combat techniques evolved, albeit slowly, adapting to changes in technology, tactics, and enemies. For example, the introduction of the English longbow in the 14th century forced knights to rethink their approach, as arrows could pierce even the best armor, leading to a greater focus on foot combat and coordination with archers and infantry. Training also included a psychological component that's often overlooked. Being a knight wasn't just about strength or skill, it required a steel mindset. In an era where death lurked around every corner, be it from battle, disease, or a tournament accident, knights had to learn to cope with fear and uncertainty. Simulated training often included high-stress scenarios, like prolonged fights or exercises against a much more experienced opponent, to teach them to stay calm under pressure. Because in a real battle, panic could be as deadly as an enemy's sword. Trainers also used techniques like repetitive drills to build confidence, because a knight who hesitated at the critical moment wasn't likely to last long. Another key element was preparing for different types of combat. While knights are best known for their cavalry charges, they also had to be ready to fight on foot, especially in the late Middle Ages when armies relied more on infantry and archers. Foot combat required a different skill set: greater agility, better shield handling, and a deeper understanding of fencing techniques. Knights practiced maneuvers like using a sword and shield in tight spaces, such as castle corridors during a siege, or fighting with pole weapons like spears or halberds, which were more common in infantry formations. These practices were often done in simulated conditions, like a castle courtyard filled with obstacles, to prepare knights for the challenges of real combat. Training also involved learning to handle terrain. Medieval battles weren't always fought on open, perfectly flat fields like in the movies. Knights often had to fight on muddy hills, dense forests, or even castle walls. Squires practiced maneuvers on different terrains, learning to keep their balance on slippery surfaces or maneuver their horse around obstacles. This required not just physical skill but a good dose of improvisation, because the battlefield was rarely as predictable as a training ground. For example, a knight who knew how to use a hill to shield himself from archers or navigate a forest without getting stuck had a significant advantage over one only prepared to charge in a straight line. The role of tournaments in training can't be understated. Beyond the spectacle and pomp, tournaments were a vital part of a knight's preparation. In addition to jousts, which were the main event, tournaments included foot combat, melees, and sometimes archery or javelin throwing competitions. These events allowed knights to test their skills against real opponents with less risk, or at least slightly less, than a deadly battle. They were also a chance to gain prestige, catch the eye of a powerful lord, or even earn some coin to pay for a new suit of armor. But beyond the glory, tournaments were a way to keep skills sharp and learn from mistakes without paying the ultimate price. A knight who lost a joust could learn from their errors and try again. In battle, that opportunity didn't always exist. Training also varied by historical context. In the early Middle Ages, when knights were primarily heavy cavalry, the focus was on charges and lance work. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, with the rise of projectile weapons like the longbow and crossbow, knights had to adapt to a more defensive style. They learned to use more articulated armor for greater mobility and to coordinate with infantry and archers. In some regions, like Italy, knights even began training with primitive firearms, like arquebus, though these never fully replaced the sword and lance. This shift reflected the evolving nature of medieval warfare, which became increasingly complex and demanded greater versatility from knights. Knightly training was also influenced by military orders like the Templars or Hospitallers. These orders combined military training with a strong religious component, meaning knights didn't just learn to fight but also to live by a strict code of discipline and devotion. The Templars, for example, were known for their rigorous training, which included long hours of weapons practice, grueling physical exercises, and periods of fasting or meditation to strengthen the spirit. While these orders were a minority, their influence on secular knights was significant, especially in regions like the Holy Land or the Iberian Peninsula, where fighting non-Christian enemies was a priority. Training also had a social component. Knights didn't just train to be warriors but also leaders. As members of the nobility, they were often expected to lead troops, negotiate with other lords, or even manage lands on behalf of their lord. This meant training included lessons in leadership, diplomacy, and, in some cases, basic administration. Squires learned by observing their knights, noting how they dealt with soldiers, resolved disputes, or motivated men before a battle. These skills were as important as wielding a sword, because a knight who couldn't inspire his troops was little more than a guy in fancy armor. Trainers often put squires in situations where they had to make leadership decisions, like leading a small group in a mock battle, to prepare them for the responsibilities that came with knighthood. Training also involved a good deal of improvisation. In a world where resources were limited, knights and squires often had to make do with what they had. If there wasn't a proper training ground, they practiced in a forest clearing. If there were no practice weapons, they used sticks or farm tools. And if no weapons master was available, they learned from older knights or even common soldiers. This adaptability was crucial, because in war, things rarely went as planned. A knight who could improvise a tactic in the heat of battle had a much better chance of surviving than one who only knew how to follow orders. This mindset also applied to equipment maintenance. A knight who could repair damaged armor or improvise a lance from a branch could keep fighting even when all seemed lost. Training also impacted a knight's daily life. Even when not on the battlefield or in a tournament, knights maintained a regimen of exercises to stay in shape. This could include daily sword practice, horseback riding, or even activities like hunting, which wasn't just a noble pastime but a way to practice tracking, aim, and teamwork. Hunting, in particular, was popular among knights, as it allowed them to practice using the bow, lance, or even a falcon while enjoying a day in the field, and, hopefully, getting something for dinner. Knights also participated in physical games, like friendly wrestling or strength competitions, which not only kept their skills sharp but also fostered camaraderie among them. Training was also influenced by the seasons. In winter, when wars often paused due to weather, knights took advantage of indoor or covered training grounds. This could include mock combats in castle courtyards, strategy lessons around a table, or friendly competitions among the castle's knights and squires. In summer, training intensified, with long outdoor sessions taking advantage of daylight hours. But regardless of the season, training never stopped completely, because a knight who let laziness take over could find himself out of shape at the worst possible moment. Trainers often organized season-specific activities, like archery practice in winter to improve accuracy or mock battles in summer to take advantage of good weather. Training also had a cultural component. In many regions, knights were seen as models of virtue, and their training reflected medieval society's values. In France, for example, chivalry was steeped in romantic ideals, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and protecting the weak. In England, the focus was more practical, prioritizing discipline and combat effectiveness. In regions like the Iberian Peninsula, where war against Muslims was a constant, training had a strong religious component, with knights seeing their role as a holy crusade. These values shaped not just the training but also how knights saw themselves and their place in the world. A French knight might dream of heroic deeds inspired by epic songs, while a Spanish knight might see himself as a soldier of God, fighting for the faith. Training also included a competitive element. Knights didn't just compete in tournaments but also among themselves in daily life. Squires, in particular, were constantly trying to outdo each other, whether in a mock fight, a horse race, or even who could polish armor faster. This competition kept knights motivated and fostered camaraderie, because while everyone wanted to be the best, they also knew they depended on each other in battle. Trainers often encouraged this competition, organizing challenges or internal tournaments to keep squires on their toes, but they also ensured it didn't turn into destructive rivalry, because a group of knights who couldn't work together was as useful as an army of cats. Training also impacted knights' health. While constant exercise kept them fit, injuries were a constant threat. Knights and squires learned to treat basic wounds, like cuts or bruises, but serious injuries could be devastating. A poorly healed fracture could leave a knight lame, and an infection could be deadly in an era without antibiotics. That's why knights also learned to listen to their bodies, recognize signs of exhaustion, and take steps to avoid unnecessary injuries. This wasn't always easy, especially for young squires eager to prove themselves, but it was a crucial part of their training. Trainers often emphasized the importance of self-care, because a knight who couldn't take care of himself couldn't take care of his lord or his men. Training also involved continuous learning. Knights didn't stop learning once they were knighted. Every battle, tournament, or encounter with a new opponent was a chance to improve. More experienced knights often shared their knowledge with younger ones, creating a cycle of learning that ensured combat techniques evolved over time. This learning as an Englishman wasn't limited to physical skills. It also included lessons in leadership, strategy, and, in some cases, diplomacy. Because a knight wasn't just a warrior but also a leader, a diplomat, and, in many cases, a symbol of his time's values. Training also affected knights' social lives. While they spent much time practicing, they also participated in castle life, attending banquets, ceremonies, and other social events. These occasions weren't just a chance to rest but also to practice the etiquette skills learned as pages. A knight who could impress a noble with his courtesy or win a lady's favor with a well-placed compliment had as much chance of advancing his career as one who excelled on the battlefield. Because in the Middle Ages, politics and warfare were so intertwined that a knight needed to be as skilled with words as with a sword. Training also included mental preparation for war. While tournaments and mock battles could mimic the chaos of combat, nothing could fully prepare a knight for the real thing. Trainers tried to bridge this gap by exposing squires to high-stress situations, like prolonged fights or ambush simulations, but ultimately, the only way to learn to handle war was to experience it. That's why many young knights accompanied their lords to battle as squires, not to fight but to observe and learn. These experiences were often terrifying but invaluable, teaching squires what it really meant to be a knight. Not just skill and strength, but also courage, sacrifice, and, in many cases, the ability to keep going even when all seemed lost. Training was also influenced by technological advances. As armor became more sophisticated, knights had to learn to use it properly. Plate armor, popularized in the late Middle Ages, was lighter and more articulated than earlier chainmail, but also more complex. Knights practiced moving in these armors, adjusting them for maximum mobility, and removing them quickly in emergencies. They also learned to deal with armor's limitations, like reduced vision through a helmet or the difficulty of getting up from the ground if they fell. These skills were critical, because armor could be both a protection and a trap if you didn't know how to use it properly. Training also included preparation for leadership. As nobles, knights often had to lead troops, whether a small group of soldiers or an entire army. This meant learning to give clear orders, maintain morale, and make quick decisions in the heat of battle. Squires practiced these skills in mock exercises, where they were assigned command of a small group and tasked with solving a tactical problem, like defending a position or leading a charge. These experiences taught them not just to lead but to earn their men's respect, because a knight who couldn't inspire trust was little more than a guy in fancy armor. Training also impacted knights' personal lives. While the image of the lone knight is common in stories, the reality is that knights relied on a network of relationships to survive. Squires formed close bonds with their peers, trainers, and lords, and these relationships often lasted a lifetime. Training wasn't just a way to learn skills but also to build a community, because in the Middle Ages, nobody survived alone. A knight who could count on his comrades in battle had a much better chance of coming out alive, and training was where those bonds were forged. Training also included preparation for death. The Middle Ages were a brutal time, and knights knew every battle could be their last. Trainers often spoke openly about death, not to scare squires but to prepare them mentally. Knights learned to accept the possibility of dying in combat, not as something to fear but as part of their duty. This mindset not only gave them courage but also helped them stay calm in desperate situations, because a knight who didn't fear death could focus on the task at hand. In summary, a medieval knight's training was a long, complex, and often exhausting process. From the days as a page, running after a noble with a jug of wine, to the years as a squire, sweating under armor while trying not to fall off a horse, to finally being knighted and continuing to train to stay sharp, every stage was designed to forge not just a warrior but a symbol of medieval society. It wasn't an easy path, and it definitely wasn't as glamorous as the movies make it seem. But for those who completed it, being a knight meant being ready to face any challenge, whether an enemy on the battlefield, a rival in a tournament, or simply the weight of armor that seemed determined to turn you into a metal turtle. And though the process could be tough, it was also, in its own way, a test of endurance, ingenuity, and, yes, a bit of humor to survive the bruises and falls.